In about 4 months, the Oculus Rift is scheduled to finally release, bringing us one step closer to living a cyberpunk dystopia of disassociative virtual experiences. During the early years of VR, it will be experiences similar to frictional games as SOMA that will help popularize the idea. Simple, slow-paced, first-person video games about exploring and interacting with a tactile and meticulously detailed world. Although Frictional's engine does not yet have VR support, it's hard to imagine fans not attempting to hack it in at some point, and just saying that makes me realize how close we are to living this game's source material. SOMA is an homage to the darker science fiction of the 60s and 70s that eventually led up to the cyberpunk aesthetic, bringing the worlds and questions of Philip K. Dick and Harlan Ellison to life, with a brutally industrial visual style that's just a few flesh blobs south of H.R. Geiger. You play as any normal, unremarkable dude who just suddenly wakes up in the middle of a futuristic underwater research station with no clue how or why you got there, and that's not just a quick and easy video game setup for a quick and easy video game story. Finding out how and why you got there are questions that are exhaustively addressed through mind-melting answers that truly do those authors justice, thanks to a story that has more ghosts swapping in and out of more shells than a Mass Effect cosplay party. Just like any great sci-fi, it captivates the imagination with the morbid implications of questions that may face mankind's future. It creates situations where innocuous actions that are normal in this universe are contextualized into heavy-handed, disturbing atrocities. I don't really want to spoil it though, because the writing in here is mostly pretty great stuff. It's both great horror and great sci-fi. Although the main protagonist here seems to suffer from a bit of Jason Brody syndrome in terms of how vocally innocuous he is about the ridiculous situations he's drunkenly stumbling past, but for the most part it's pretty great. It's gonna be great. But you gotta get your expectations in check before diving in. This is not Amnesia 2, and you can tell after just the first hour. It begins with a lot of friendly voices and absurdist humor, starting as a kind of black comedy about weird science, kind of like Portal, before taking a literal dive down into the crippling black isolation that is more familiar with Frictional's previous lineup. And speaking of which, it's also a bit of a step backwards from Amnesia. It's closer to a Penumbra Black Plague with even less of a features list. There's no need to manage flashlight batteries or medicine pills here. Your inventory will just solely consist of 1 or 2 puzzle items at any given time, and most sections that have you trudging past monsters just play a bit too simple to really convey a deep sense of dread. Running low on resources and mismanaging your inventory to a point of desperation is a real layer of personal, play-based horror that dark hallways and flashing lights alone just cannot convey. And SOMA misses out on a lot of what seems to be an intended horror atmosphere by stripping out extra layers of interactive horror. The simplicity of the system really bites it in the ass whenever you got a monster encounter. Just like in the last games, you have to stealth past horrible beasties that you can't look at or get close to, but can easily outrun. And in the second half, you can easily tell what's coming just by the lay of the land. But unlike the last game, there are no wardrobes or lockers to dash into. And unlike the AAA appropriation of this playstyle in Alien Isolation, you can't crouch low enough to squeeze under desks. There's a real lack of hiding spots here. The levels just don't feel like they have enough cover to be designed for a game of hide and seek, which every frictional horror game essentially is. Just like Black Plague, monsters in this one permanently patrol hallways and have to be persistently avoided as you find your way to your next checkpoint or do a bit of back and forth for fetch quest items. But go one game back and you'll find a very similar system that was still much more effective. Almost every encounter in Amnesia had every monster disappear to a timer, in addition to its levels having an abundance of hiding places, which made it a much easier game in comparison, yet still pretty repetitive in its own way, but it was more effective horror, since by the end of the game you still might be thinking those monsters worked in mysterious ways. You didn't often get pinned by them and have to trigger your own death yourself because they would just block your exit without actually running at you to finish the deal, nor moving out of the way of your escape route, and that just happened to me a bunch in SOMA. Running and hiding from something you can't see is terrible, it's great, but dying and retrying over and over again until you learn a good route around them turns the whole experience into something much too methodical to really feel like the kind of desperate, improvised chase scene that this loud music and long hallway seem to imply. And that's what breaks the illusion here. It's the inconsistent, wishy-washy AI monsters that give you easy glimpses at the zippers behind their costumes. Getting creative and trying to block their path with physics objects and locked doors, which was a tactic that was encouraged and fully implemented in Amnesia, just breaks the AI in this one. There are so few hiding spots that it's easy to get pinned, but manage to find one with some good visibility and you might spot the AI despawn after finishing its search, or close a door to block one and the two of you get locked in an infinite loop. But all of these problems with the monsters come despite them appearing and appealing to a very well-paced story that doesn't have any of them overstaying their welcome. They barely even reuse the same monster twice. Though they all play by similar rules, they look and act diverse enough to really make every encounter feel fresh. I remember the very first monster vividly. Unlike the others, it's one that's almost begging to be looked at. It's a sputtering, steaming mess of a lovingly detailed biomechanical monstrosity lit up like a Christmas tree. It's a beautiful design. It's just unfortunate that most of the other monsters seem to follow a less inspired walking chicken nugget motif. They don't really meet the same production values. Speaking of wonky production values, what's the deal with these monitors? Glitchy screens don't flicker or move, they're barely animated. The scan lines don't move, it's just the weirdest thing, but it weirded me out. The real gritty, Geiger-esque mechanical and underwater sections of these maps look wonderful, but for whatever reasons, the artistic talent that is there just couldn't seem to handle monitors. And character models for human beings, but that one's a little more understandable, but having trouble with monitors on the other hand, that's a new one on me. But regardless, it's hard not to recommend SOMA on some level. I don't know if it's worth specifically going out of your way for it. It's not a thoroughly satisfying, bombastic horror spectacle. If you've got $30 to throw around, then go right ahead. If you don't, wait for a price drop, but in either case, you're probably going to feel well taken care of by this thing. It's just a little bit unpolished, is all. But what you're buying is a story that asks grotesque, bizarre, sometimes funny, but mostly disturbing cyberpunk questions in a neat little 8-hour, $30 horror adventure that wraps things up with a real mindfuck of an ending that makes perfect sense while raising more questions about our own selves than it does the questions of the story. And that's something that only the very best sci-fi can do, and there's definitely value to that. Using video game interfaces as a medium to tell cool little stories is something I'm totally down for, so it's good that in this case, it's well worth diving deep into this story.